Okay, maybe I'll just start off by kind of introducing myself. My name is Irteqa, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the author of Reza Reza. Just something kind of interesting. I'm not sure that it's not that interesting, but like I have two dogs. Their names are Pluto and Juno. I love coffee, and the last book I read was probably The Tradition by Jericho Brown. I'm super excited to be here and to talk to Terese and to be a part of this beautiful conversation. And yeah, let's get it. Let's do this.
All right. Hi, I'm Terese. I'm the author of Manifest. And some interesting things about me. I like cats. I have a cat. I have a cat. Her name is Benjamin. I also like makeup and The Sims. And I'm just getting into D&D, and I'm really excited about that. And the last book that I read, well, I'm currently reading it. It's The Lumberjack's Dove by Reza. I did read The Tradition by Jericho Brown. It's excellent. I really love it.
It is, yeah. It's beautiful. I absolutely love it. Yes, maybe I'll just start off with the first question that I have here for you, Trez. What is the strongest or most affecting or powerful feeling that you have ever encountered reading a poem?
I think the strongest feeling that I've ever felt reading a poem was awe. I thought it would be sadness, actually. But I don't think I've ever felt sad reading a poem in a way that was very strong. I think if I've ever felt sad, I was like, oh, and then I kind of move on. But with awe, it's just sort of like it's all encompassing. And I see a line that like really resonates with me. I have to take some time and process it like away from the poem. Sometimes I'll like walk around my house just like repeating the line over and over, or I'll share it with like someone I know just so they can feel the same thing as me, you know? What about you?
For me, that's wonderful. I think I'm kind of the same. I don't know if I have a word to describe it, but like I do relate in the way that, you know, I read it and I'm like struck. I feel like, I don't know if this is kind of a thing, but like it kind of just like I'm trembling kind of, my heart is trembling because I'm so overwhelmed. Maybe that could be kind of something to put it into words, but like overwhelmed by this poem that just strikes me as like the ultimate truth or something, you know, like something that I've never ever read before. And then I would go and like share it with people and be like, oh my God, please read this. Like this is something so, you know, novel and something so out of this world that, you know, you have to read this. It'll change your life.
Yeah, and they like have to agree. Like, you have to feel like you have to understand, like, let me convince you that this is the line. So my question for you is, what were the challenges that you faced writing your chapbook, Reza Reza?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm kind of a bit of a beginner with the whole publication process and kind of just writing professionally, because most of my life I've kind of just been like an amateur writer, or like I've done it as a hobby or something that I enjoy. But like I think the thing is that I have a lot of supportive people around me, like my friends and family, who have been encouraging me since like I first started writing to, you know, keep going and you know, publish your work if you want, share your work, get some feedback on your work. And so I think that's kind of sustained me and helped me go through with the rest of this journey. But in terms of challenges, I feel like I never write enough. It's weird, but like I take a long time to write something I'm happy with. And I feel like I'm extra critical of myself that way, that, you know, if it's not good enough, then I'm like, well, what's the point of, you know, putting it, like publishing it somewhere or including it in the chapbook. So I think one of those challenges was kind of coming to terms with myself that, you know, this is good enough. I'm good enough, you know, I can publish this and share it because these are my feelings and this is my sense of self that I'm trying to put into this book and share with people around me. And so I think kind of more of a metaphysical or spiritual kind of challenge of that sort of thing. And then technically, I feel like, again, like writing enough for it to be presented in the form of a chapbook and kind of having quality material, I feel like is what I really wanted to emphasize for myself. So yeah, I think those are kind of some of the challenge, the main challenges that I feel like I encountered while publishing Reza Reza. And with that, maybe I'll go on to my next question for you. I'm excited about this one. In your opinion, who determines what is or isn't a poem?
I also like this question because I don't know what the answer is to that question. I think like a lot of people have a lot of opinions about poetry, and I think that that's just like the case with like art in general. It's not like math, right, where it's like this is the answer. But I think that poetry as like a form or as a genre is very amenable to different kinds of people. So the question of like what is a poem, I think you can ask like 10 people and get like 15 different answers or something like that. And people can sort of do what they want with poetry. They can use poetry to sort of do what they want, kind of. And that kind of in that kind of art. So I don't think there's like a real, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to
don't
this
apologize.
question.
Absolutely no need to apologize.
But at the same time, I feel like in my brain, I know what a poem is. Like I have an idea of what a poem is in my brain, but I don't know how to articulate that at all. I just like, I'll know it when I see it. I'm like, that's a poem. That's not a poem. Or I can be convinced if I don't think it's a poem that like actually it is a poem. I'm like, okay, yeah. What about you?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. Honestly, I think it's kind of one of those rhetorical or even like open-ended questions. But like a lot of times I find myself thinking, if I read something, I'm like, this is kind of poetic. I like it. It's a poem. And then other times something that's like visually presented as a poem, I read it and I'm like, is that a poem though? Like, I don't know, like not to be judgmental or anything, not to like be super critical of people, but I feel like sometimes I do tend to think in black and white, and that's not something that I want, and that's not a good thing to me. And so like these days, I feel like I'm challenging myself more and more to understand that poetry is really fluid. It's like, it's alive. It's a living being to me, and to a lot of writers as well. And so I just feel like you said, like there's no clear answer for who or what determines it. It's just, like you said, it's something that everyone has access to, and it's for everybody. The poetry is for everybody. And there's no like, in my mind, like dictations about what it can or can't be. And so I think it's important to think more along the lines of like fluidity and flexibility, especially as we move forward, because I would be like terrified and really heartbroken if poetry like kind of started fading away because people were too pressed about, this is a poem and this isn't a poem, and just kind of dictating, what it can and can't be. So I feel like in order to, give it that life that we feel so passionate about, it's important to look at it as something very fluid and meaningful.
I think like what's also interesting is that like you can still ask that question, but in sort of like a framework. So I'm an editor, for example. I edit poetry at Augur magazine and other things like that. So I can ask like, what is or isn't a poem for Augur magazine or for this magazine or for whatever. And I think there you can be sort of black and white if you want to be. But in terms of like everyone and like everywhere, I think like being fluid is useful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how would you describe the tone of your poetry? Not just like within the chap, like I don't know if you have other like, work elsewhere, but just broadly, how would you describe the tone of your poetry?
Yeah, so if tone is kind of like my attitude toward what I sit down and write, I feel like in general, thus far, I feel like my tone is more kind of meditative and kind of curative in a way. It's healing for me personally, and like political. Like I intentionally kind of go after political things because I feel like poetry is inherently political, right? Like we're trying to get our messages across in a way. So yeah, I feel like in a way it's like me just talking to myself, and kind of trying to console myself in a lot of the concerns or the desires, the wishes, the thoughts that I express in my writing. And so if that can kind of be described as tone, and like Reza Reza in general, it's an Urdu word which means destruction, or like something that's to be shorn into pieces. And I feel like it has a negative connotation because it's used in a very tragic sense. But for me, I kind of wanted to take that and interpret it in a way that it wasn't only about me, destroying myself or me kind of shattering my identity, but also more about me building myself back up and kind of infusing that desire to find out who I am with hope and with love and, light. So if that's a good enough response.
No, that's good. I think I saw that a lot when I was reading your chapbook. I felt like I could settle in to your work, if that makes sense. And I could just sort of like be taken like with you. And that's like, I feel like I don't always have that with every like poem that I read. So I like that your work had that.
Thank you so much. How would you kind of, describe your tone in your writing? A core idea maybe.
I feel like I write two different kinds of poems. And I feel like one poem is like clean, and then one poem is kind of one other poem is kind of messy. But I try to be contemplative in my tone with my poetry, but not like super abstract. I'm having a hard time answering this question.
No, that's great. That's great. I understand. I relate to in a way. I feel like I tend to lean more towards abstraction and like, overthinking it sometimes. But no, that's great.
Yeah, I like to bring in like interesting things about the real world too, if I can.
Yeah. I do like I literally go out of my way to like do research on something. Like if I want to talk about it, in an appropriate, respectful way, I'm like, you know what, I should do some background research on what this means. I know where this is coming from, and try to incorporate that in a really smooth way in my work. So yeah, like same with me. That's an important thing to me about my writing, is that it kind of reflects reality in a lot of ways and kind of what's going on in the world around me and my perceptions of what's going on. So yeah, I'll go on to the next question then for you. I ask, as poets, how do we reconcile with the awareness that once our work is out in the world, there's nothing we can do to change it? And I feel like this is something I grapple with a lot, and I have been for a long time. And I feel like for a while, it kind of gave me this sense of self-doubt and fear that, what if I communicated something that's misunderstood by people? Or what if my audience doesn't relate to my work or doesn't get what I'm trying to say, and I can't do anything about it anymore because it's in the world. How do you think we kind of deal with those feelings? Is there a way to deal with that, or is it just, something we can't help?
Okay, so I think that like as creative people, or like as artists, like making your work available to like the public or publishing your work, I feel like it requires a certain level of vulnerability. And confidence too, right? And humility, but like mainly vulnerability. So I think like reconciling that awareness, to reference your question, I think is about like how much you can hold and accept that vulnerability in a way that's respectful to yourself. Like you want to respect yourself, right? Your own feelings, but also to the work, which is you are presenting to other people as like either as a product or as a piece of your heart or something like that. And like asking yourself if you're okay with being vulnerable, because not everyone's okay with being vulnerable. You have to be like honest with yourself. Are you actually okay with sending your work out there? And if not, then that's okay. Like you don't have to publish everything. But also like being honest about like why you wanted to put your work out in the world. And like because as you said, there's nothing really you can do to change it. I find that having like an idea of who your audience is, like a specific person, not just like people like me or like, I've heard like one author I know talked about her audience, who she was writing to her 14-year-old self, right? So it's like she only had to think about like, am I okay sharing this with my 14-year-old self? And that's how she sort of moved through that. But I think that is something that I'll always be continuing to think about, like as I continue to publish, because I have a lot of anxiety too. So like when I send my work out, I'm like, oh no, what if people hate it? Like that was my thing with Manifest. Like I like writing like speculative poetry and things like that. But when I sent it out there, or when I published it with Gap Riot, I was like, what if people don't like it? What am I gonna do? I can't do anything about it, right? It's out there. So I think that's something I have to keep learning.
I absolutely love Manifest, by the way. I thought it was fantastic. It was beautiful. Like I saw the cover when it was first released and I was like,
I love the cover.
Okay, that checks off the first point. And then like I started reading and I was like, okay, that is just, oh my goodness, phenomenal. I absolutely loved your work. Your writing is beautiful.
Thank you.
Don't doubt yourself. And I think your response actually like low-key made me emotional. Like that's beautiful. I don't have enough words to kind of describe how perfectly, the sense of what's the word I'm looking for, kind of consolation that I received from that, because that's just absolutely beautiful. I have a lot of conversations of that sort with my mom as well. She's a poet, but she does traditional Urdu poetry. And she's been writing since she was a teenager, but she's like my role model. And she's that one person I have a lot of these troubling or like, murky conversations with respect to poetry. So I feel like I get kind of a sense of, peace and comfort from her words, which is really similar to what you just told me. And I think that just, I feel so good hearing that from you. And I feel like I'm not alone, which is great.
I don't want you to feel alone. I want you to feel like part of a community.
Thank you. Thank you. I really do. I am. I'm experiencing that thrill and that happiness of being part of a group of people who, share the same feelings about something, the same passion about something as you do. And, it makes you feel like the world is kind of a warmer and more hopeful place, especially these days when, things are really tense. And kind of, not going right, I feel like. Yeah, so my next question for you is, or wait, no, is it your turn to ask me?
Yeah, no, I was gonna ask, like, speaking, you mentioned your mom,
Yeah.
which sort of like leads into my next question about a lot of the poems in Reza Reza, which we'll hold up so people can see. This also nice. I love this cover. This is beautiful cover.
Thank you.
Oh,
thanks.
I like that it's like wide as well. Anyway, so my question was, a lot of the poems in Reza Reza reference within them like a woman, specifically a mother figure, as well as God. Like some lines you have are like Lady of Heaven or wily womanhood, or you have something Mama's thumbs slicing bitter gourd. Like those are just lines that I picked for this question. So do you seek to, in your poems, do you seek to make a connection between womanhood or motherhood and the divine? And what do you connect to and value about this kind of divinity?
That's a really, really phenomenal a very
specific question.
Intricate question. I love that question. It's beautiful. And I thought about this one, I think, the most from all the questions you kind of posed, but that's wonderful. I think, in my opinion, there isn't enough literature out there on, feminist intersectional writings on spirituality and kind of the relationship between womanhood and spirituality. And historically as well, I feel like women have kind of been told that, yeah, writing about your spirituality and writing about, your innermost feelings is just a gentlemanly activity. And you just stay doing your own thing. And, you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. And in my acknowledgements, actually, my maternal great grand aunt, she was a huge source of inspiration for me. I heard her story a lot from my mom. And she was a writer back in the day. And it was very troubling for her because she was very passionate and very talented. And, she put a lot of her heart into her writing, but, she had a lot of troubles in her life because at that time, society kind of was that, women shouldn't be writing poetry. And it's just, it's not really that it's too romantic, and it just, your head is in the clouds and it's not going to do anything for you, so why bother? And it was like kind of an impediment to the ability of women to be creative and to write about their feelings and their relationship with divinity. And so I feel like I wrote Reza Reza as kind of more of an ontological reconciliation with my thoughts on spirituality and my lived experiences as an immigrant Muslim woman of color who speaks, multiple languages. And so kind of it was an effort to show that my story is intensely transformative, I feel like, for myself. And it holds that kind of power. And so I feel like Reza Reza was kind of a series of clumsy, but really, what's the word I'm looking for? Affectionate prayers to God, and kind of in a language that reflected my own intimate relationship with God. And so I identify as kind of, obviously I'm a Muslim, I mentioned before, and I feel like spirituality is a huge part of my personal identity and something that I really value and hold close to my heart. And so it was interesting for me because some of the feedback I got from Reza Reza was people were like, oh, I didn't know you were that religious, or I didn't know you were that spiritual. And I feel like those two things are just inherently subjective encounters with our innermost feelings about kind of the way that the world moves and breathes and kind of the miraculous nature of that breathing and that moving. And so to be able to confront and kind of adequately write about these feelings is not only emotionally exhaustive, I think, but it's also really and radically cathartic in a way for me. And so I feel like, back to like that topic about womanhood and spirituality, I feel like this was the one, Reza Reza was that one way for me to kind of put down into words my understanding and my feelings about my relationship with God. And so I'm not sure where else I could adequately channel that besides writing it down into poetry. I feel like poetry is a beautiful, really open medium for those types of conversations that, you might not be able to have with people in person, or to be able to express the way that you want to in person. And so I think, yeah, like that sort of thing about, making a connection between womanhood and spirituality, I think it's kind of implicit in Reza Reza. It wasn't my, I don't want to say intention, but it wasn't kind of at the forefront of my thoughts when writing, but it is something I feel like that is very embedded in Reza Reza. And I hope that kind of, I'm glad that you picked out some, phrases and some words that stood out to you. I'm glad that kind of made sense, because that was, again, something that I'd hope would kind of reflect a little bit more transparently, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. I was going to ask you also, So in sort of like your exploration and like about spirituality and femininity in your work, when you now that you've published this chapbook, I'm going to ask you the question that you asked me, which was like, how do you feel about, you know, the idea that it's out in the world now and there's nothing you can do to change it?
Yeah,
Specifically with
I
this
think,
work. Yeah.
yeah, I like with the editing process. I think oh my goodness, I can't even tell you. I bet Kate and Danny could testify. But I would like go back so many times and be like, is this good? Did I change this? Does this make sense? You know, will people like it? I did that for quite a while, kind of, especially towards the end of the process before submitting my final manuscript. But yeah, like at first I was really, honestly, really nervous about, you know, having my work out there, published in the chapbook. I just realized the gravity of it after, you know, it had been accepted. And I was like, wait a minute, people are going to read this. People are going to see this. This is me, you know, like making myself, like you said, vulnerable to people around me. People are going to read my thoughts, my innermost thoughts. And so like, yeah, there was that, like that kind of emotional reluctance or kind of like, I don't want to say anxiety, that's kind of a strong word, but like just that kind of sense that, oh my goodness, this is greater than me, you know, what's happening right now. And it's no longer just me typing on my computer or writing in my notebook. This is kind of, it's going to be everywhere. And so I had a lot of conversations with people around me, especially, like I said, my mom. And over time, I kind of came to realize that, you know what, there's really nothing we can do, honestly. Like, and even like you said, the work goes out there and we can't change it. That's not something that we have control over, but just kind of coming to terms with the fact that, you know, this is me. I'm writing for myself. I'm writing about myself. And it's me self-constructing and remaking myself and kind of coming to terms with who I am, my identity, and where I fit into the world, you know, and my relationships with people and with things and with ideas. And so slowly, I kind of started to let it go a little bit. And I was like, you know what, there's nothing I can do. I should just be proud of what I've done and feel pride and happiness in my work, because this is a part of me, right? It's my heart. And, you know, it would be, an injustice to myself to keep, you know, bringing myself down and worrying that, you know, this won't be enough or won't be good enough or people might not like it. I just feel like that's kind of disrespecting our own work and, you know, the effort that we put into presenting it and sharing it with people, because that takes a lot of courage and a lot of heart. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And then with that, I think maybe I'll go on to my other question for you. What role, in your opinion, do intersectionality, diversity, and inclusivity play in creative writing? And I think that's a really relevant question, especially in the context of what's been happening in 2020 with a lot of like, you know, with BLM, with a lot of civil justice conversations, with human rights, with, you know, conversations about violence. And so, yeah, what do you think, Terese?
I think that for a long time in the society, and by the society, I mean the Western English-speaking world, like creative writing meant like one thing. Like when you thought of creative writing or poetry in particular, there was like there's a canon, right? There's one idea of what that was supposed to be, or like one tone or one message. And certain people, particularly marginalized people of color, were thought like not even to be creative. Like we just didn't have that capacity, that higher capacity to be creative and to do work. And now we're seeing now that what counts as creative like can and does and should include like those marginalized peoples, because we have stories like that, you know, aren't being told, and you have perspectives that are valuable like no matter what anyone else says. And what I found now is that even when people of color, including, and also like queer people and disabled people, but people of color in particularly, when people are sort of like understanding that, you know, we are putting our work out there and we are having our ideas expressed, there's still like this element or this attempt to contain us to only tell like one specific kind of story, which is either like a trauma story or like, you know, if you know you're Black, you're gonna write about like Blackness. If you're Muslim, you're gonna write about, you know, Islam and all that things. Or even like memoir, right? A lot of people of color I know are like, I can write, you know, speculative fiction, or I can write, you know, really comedic poetry, but that's not really what's accepted or allowed. And I find that like breaking down those barriers can be really helpful in terms of like paving the path for like future writers. And I think that intersectionality, diversity, and inclusivity can act as like a pool or like a framing that can help to support artists. But that's like ideal, right? Some people I know can sort of like throw those words around as a way to inhibit or prevent people from specific people from being published or having their work shared, specifically if they're looking for like a certain type of like POC writing. These terms can be used as forms of tokenizing. But that's not what we want to happen. We want our work to be included and to be shared. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
No, that was wonderful. That was really thorough kind of response. I learned a lot from that response just now. That was great. And I totally agree with the whole idea that, if this kind of writing that, people of color, for example, submit to a journal, it doesn't really fit the journal's the statement or the mission statement or kind of the theme, then it's like, it kind of reminds me of the fact that, like you said, this idea that it's like compartmentalizing. I feel like if you don't fit into this mold, of a Muslim or of a woman of color, or of someone who's from the LGBTQ community, if you don't write about those experiences that we want you to write about or we want to hear, then we're not gonna give you that platform, sort of. So I feel like that is definitely something that needs to be worked on, and we can't keep going in that direction. That we want to hear you speak, but we want you to say what we want, or if that makes any sense. We want to hear what we think about you. We want you to maybe justify or kind of reaffirm our perceptions or our prejudice or our ideas about who you are, and like that just, I feel like it's so constraining and limiting that way that we can't write about things that we love, like you said, like comedy or something more like sci-fi or philosophy, whatever. There's so many opportunities, so many outlets to write about what we treasure and what we find important, from a very, again, inclusive and intersectional perspective. And I just, these days, I'm so passionate about like reading the work of women of color, writers of color, and like writers from marginalized communities. And like I remember reading on Twitter the other day, I'm not sure where exactly this was, but there was kind of this article published about how Shakespeare is dying in schools, and how schools are trying to they're starting to stray away from a curriculum where we discuss Shakespeare, we read Shakespeare. And like a lot of the comments, people are like, well, good, that's a good thing, because in that way we can make room for more transcontinental literature or more transnational literature for written by people of color, and like written by women of color, written by people from LGBTQ community, people with disabilities. And I feel like that is so relevant for our time. I keep saying relevant because this is a direction we're heading in. This kind of writing is more and more important, because those are the voices that have historically and traditionally been silenced, and if not now, then when? And I feel like moving in that direction in the future, and like making writing by people of color more accessible and more available is something that I would really love to see in the world. And it's a beautiful feeling to read that this person is from the same background as me, or they're the same race as me, they're the same ethnicity as me. I'm not alone. There are people writing like me, people who are courageous and brave, and they're sitting down and they're communicating their feelings and their innermost ideas, and it feels more collective, and just like a sense of community. I think that was a long-winded comment or response. I don't know, but
no, that's great. You talked briefly, but you mentioned briefly in your response about I'm reading someone who looks like me, and like that's so important. Like even for like people in high school, like I only read Shakespeare in high school, and I have not picked up a Shakespeare play since. Like I just don't care.
Same.
I just don't care. But like I remember, like I write a lot of speculative fiction, and I did not know who Octavia Butler was until like 2016. And I had not seen like Black women writing sci-fi and fantasy. That was just not a thing for me when I was growing up. And it was very painful to like just to see that this late, and to be like, why not then? Why now? But I'm moving forward. I'm pushing past that, and I'm making their work a part of my readership. So my next question for you is, what does writing about identity and writing about the body reveal to you about your own work?
I think in my mind, what I've learned from writing and kind of experiencing Reza Reza is that I'm always rewriting and writing myself, kind of constructing and reconstructing myself, and learning and unlearning myself. And so I find myself kind of moving in between that creative space, as a form of shelter or means of survival, in the midst of a reality that's kind of increasingly complex, self-competing and kind of interpretive and almost unknowable in a way. And so I just really love this quote by Bell Hooks. I kind of wrote it down a little bit so I could throw it out there because it's absolutely wonderful. And then Bell Hooks writes that, like desire, language disrupts, refuses to be contained within boundaries. It speaks itself against our will in words and thoughts that intrude and even violate the most private spaces of the mind and body. And I feel like that's kind of, we've touched on something like that, or we've touched on something similar in our conversation earlier. But to me, identities are kind of infinitely incalculable. Like you can't put your finger on what an identity is, or, you know, where it comes from, or what it's inspired by, or how it moves, and kind of where it originates. But I feel like the body comparatively is a lot more honest and intentional. And so I think that because the body kind of exists in an open space, writing about it has taught me that pouring myself into and feeling comfortable with the idea that breaking apart endlessly is kind of a natural part of giving birth to art and kind of engendering art, and establishing its rootedness and permanency. And I don't know if I can truly ever know my own writing. I don't think a lot of writers can even say that they know their own writing, but I think I recognize and kind of hope to expand on that awareness that my writing is alive and it's temperamental and it's full of desire. And that's kind of something I'd like to carry with me as I go forward and as I keep trying to become the writer or the poet that I want to be. And so, yeah, I think in a way, just that connection between the body and identity, again, like I feel like there's a dichotomy between those two things, and I kind of strove to merge them or kind of blend them together, bring them together in a way that was reflective of my experiences. Again, like I keep saying, as a Muslim woman of color, living in Canada. And that was like the one way for me to truly come to terms with, you know, who I am and who I want to be, where I'm going, where I am right now. Yeah. And then I think for my next question for you, yeah, this is kind of something, again, like I really wanted to ask these questions because I think about these a lot myself, and I don't have an answer to them. I'm not sure if people, you know, it is possible to have an answer, but I feel like this is kind of something I've encountered and experienced as a writer myself, especially with respect to my audience and kind of their response to my writing. But do you think it is important for poetry to be redefined and redesigned according to the tastes of contemporary readers or readers who are more unfamiliar with the craft, in order for it to be more comprehensible or meaningful? I feel like this kind of goes into that whole emergence of like Instagram poetry and kind of Insta poets, because they're like extremely popular these days. And I feel like they're part of like that resurgence and that relevance attached to poetry these days, because people can really connect to the type of language that they use to describe their feelings and their experiences and their lives. And so do you think that, you know, poetry should be redefined and redesigned according to those kinds of tastes, and like for people that don't know about it as much versus people that like enjoy it a lot or know about it, in order for it to be kind of meaningful? Or, you know, is it just kind of, we should just let it go the way it is and kind of progress naturally?
I like this question. This question has like, I had one answer to this question, and now I'm just like, as you were talking, I was like, now I have like 4 answers to this question. But when
I'd love to hear all of them.
When I saw what the question initially, you had put like quotations around like comprehensible and meaningful, because I immediately thought like, to who, right? Like comprehensible to who, or meaningful to who, right? And I talked about it earlier about how like there's so many different kinds of like poetry. There's so many different kinds of people out there in the world, and poetry's been around for like literally thousands of years. Like poetry as a form is so old, you know, whether written or spoken. I think that because there's so many different kinds of poetry out there, not everyone is going to like everything. And, you know, that's the case for like other forms of literature as well. Like not everyone is going to like every single novel or every single article. And not everyone's going to have access or want to access or will be able to access everything. So I think I don't think that poetry as a whole, like as a form, needs to be like redesigned or redefined. I don't think that's super important. I just think there needs to be more poetry. Like there should be more kinds of poetry. I think more people should write poetry. They should write the poetry that speaks to them and that best reflects, you know, their emotions and their own lived experiences and their goals also for life. People write poetry for many different things. A lot of people I know write poetry to heal from, or to explore themselves, or to just because it's fun. You just want to write like a Sistina, just because.
Yeah.
I don't want to write a Sistina. I might. And I think that the institutions within poetry, and the gatekeepers in poetry, like whoever, like, you know, like the Griffin Poetry Prize, or like the Iowa Writers Workshop, or, you know, the Poetry Foundation, or like all these institutions, they're sort of built within poetry. I think that those places should be more open-minded of the variety of poetry that exists. As like we talked about before, you know, in terms of like intersectionality and diversity, that, you know, before, like there was this one idea of like what poetry was or what poetry could be. You know, like you had to use a specific form, or you couldn't use this kind of vernacular, and all that's changing now. And these institutions also have to catch up in a way that doesn't, you know, further harm and tokenize, you know, marginalized writers, because that sometimes happens as well. And I, you know, and like, so, and give center stage and focus to these different kinds of newer work. Like, a lot of people are, I think, surprised when, you know, like new poets or younger poets or emerging poets write something. They're like, oh, I didn't know that people like that could write poetry like that. And I'm like, you're not paying attention, right? There's so much work out there. But of course, you know, I as a poet, you know, as like a person with bias, want people to be interested in the kinds of poetry that I'm interested in. So I do want to share that as much as possible, but I also want people to find their own poetry. I don't read a lot of Instagram poetry. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the kind of poetry that I'm not really into. I kind of want to fight a poem a little bit. I'm like, what do you mean? And then when I and then when I get the answer, I'm just like, I feel like I'm accomplished. But I know like meaning in general is like, you know, we need to move past that as well. Like what a poetry means is, what a poem means is not always like the question to ask. But if people are reading those kinds of poems and are seeing themselves in the poems, or they're seeing that the poem is speaking to them and is making them feel good, and is especially making them want to read more poetry or explore more poetry, I think that's really what's most important. I'm not going to knock like Instagram poets. I'm not going to knock like Rupi Kaur or those people. Like if they're getting people interested in poetry, which is all we want, right? As writers, we want people to read our work. So they're doing a great job, and I totally applaud them and what they're doing. I'm just going to be over here in my corner of Toronto with my friends who are poets, and we're going to write our poems, and we're going to be happy, and we're going to read each other's work. So I don't think poetry as a whole needs to change radically. I think it needs to just be more open, is the short answer.
That was absolutely wonderful. Like, I feel like I totally get what you're saying with that. Like, a lot of times people will kind of pick up my chapbook and be like, oh yeah, I read your chapbook, and you know what, I feel a little dumb because I don't understand it, and I'm sorry, I don't understand. And
they apologize. So why are you apologizing?
Right. I find myself saying over and over, you do not need to apologize about not understanding it. That's not even the main point, right? I just want you to feel something and to experience something, learn something maybe that you haven't learned before, and maybe find yourself more interested in poetry as a genre, and more interested in reading about it, and what you know, what it means for people and for writers who write it. So I absolutely got you on that note. I feel like that's the same response I always give to people too. I just like, you don't need to apologize or anything, you know. It's about the experience while you read, and kind of what you gain from that. But yeah, like same with me. I don't, you know, spend too much time reading Instagram poetry myself, but I do respect the work of like a lot of Instagram poets that have kind of made poetry more accessible and more, you know, maybe interesting for people who didn't necessarily enjoy it or were intimidated by it before, almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so yeah, like this kind of goes back to our conversation a little bit about poetry being a living being, like a fluid being that moves and breathes and, you know, changes and shifts a lot. And I feel like that's a natural part of the genre itself, that like as time kind of goes by, a lot of trends come and go, and a lot of innovations come and go, and the craft is like evolving a lot. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, that we're kind of going forward in a direction that kind of enables us to critically look at the genre and be like, okay, what's it becoming? You know, what can we do to kind of expand on it, make it more inclusive, make it more diverse, and amplify those voices that were traditionally and historically, you know, excluded from participation or from being represented in this genre. And so that I absolutely agree with you on that. No, I think that was a really great response. Thank you for that. I'm not like, I think it's not to say that, Instagram poetry or anything that isn't traditional poetry isn't like valid or isn't important, because again, I think it's important to make space for all people, like you said too, like all people who want to write and who want to read and who want to explore the genre and who feel a connection with it. And I think it's your turn to ask me a question.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you like another super specific question, which is about, well, maybe, I don't know, it's about language choice.
Okay.
So it's when I was reading Reza Reza, I found like these really interesting like phrases like throughout your like poems. I'm gonna read some. Like, so one here is like teeth aching atrophy, and I was like, how do you do that with words? Like these words, I know what these words mean individually, but like together they just mean something different. I've written down gossamer blood cells, and uterine daisies, corpses melting into nectar. So I'm just like, wow, like that's so cool. And I'm like, I love when poets do this. I can like gush about like language with poetry. And that's why I appreciate poetry like over like any other kind of writings, because poetry can do that. And it's fun, it's okay, and it's encouraged. So my question for you is, what is your editing process specifically for like language choice? Like, how did you come up with like teeth aching atrophy? Like what happened? How did that happen?
Okay. Honestly, I feel like language is something that I had always wanted to highlight in Reza Reza. And that's something that I wanted people to look at and be like, okay, that's kind of interesting. How does that work? Okay. But like for me, like language is something that I feel like I'm really passionate about. And I have kind of, more than anything, I've worked a lot on like my diction, or kind of my sense of understanding of words and what they mean. I love words. I don't know, I just love them. And like every time I kind of encounter this word that I think is really like phenomenal, or really like messy, or really strange, or kind of resonant with me, I write it down on a list, and I'm like, okay, I'll keep this in mind. And then when I go and write a poem, I just take my list and I start like mashing words together. I'm like, could this work? I feel like this is so elementary and so like probably not what you were expecting, but like,
no, I do this too.
Mm-hmm. So I was like, I look at my list and I'm like, well, these two words kind of, they sound really good together. Like the flow is good, even though they kind of seem like they might be contradicting each other in meaning. And so I feel like a lot of times I write these words down and I'm like, I like this word. And then I'm like, well, why don't I just kind of experiment a little bit and like put this word with another word? Like my intention sometimes is to kind of have more of like a physical thing, like for example, like an apple, and then I like attach a more, what's the word, more like philosophical or a more fluid an idea to the apple, like the imagery of the apple, if that makes any sense. Like apple, and kind of give it a characteristic, like an intellectual apple. That's a horrible example, but like give it like kind of a personality almost, or like give it life and kind of make it a thing or a being. And so like a lot of times that's the one point in my editing process that I go back and I try to pinpoint some of the weaknesses. For example, like if I think that this isn't like a good enough phrase, or the metaphor isn't strong enough, or it doesn't make sense together, I will go back and read it over and over. And that's like the one thing, again, that I focus a lot on when writing a poem and constructing a poem. So yeah, it's kind of just about my love of words, and kind of if I'm attracted to this specific word, I'm like, let me just note this down. And then I go back and I think about it a lot. I kind of ponder about the ways it could mean multiple things, and kind of if it can mean multiple things and what it could represent. And then I kind of, the more meanings the word has, the more meanings a word has, I feel like the more I can do with it, and kind of the more I can experiment with it. And like aesthetically as well, like if I like how it looks and sounds, I'm like, this is great, you know what, I'm gonna go with this. And kind of move forward in that direction. We have a teeth aching atrophy thing. Teeth aching is it's so visceral, and like you read that word, you're like, I can feel my teeth aching right now. Like I can experience that. And then just the notion of adding atrophy to it, I feel like gives it a more human, or enhances that human characteristic of the word, and for people and readers to be able to see it live before them, kind of. So the imagery and the visuals and the aesthetics, I guess, are also like a main contributing force behind my use of words, I think. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. I have my notes app, and I make little notes of either words I think are interesting, or like phrases that I just hear around and like, oh, that sounds cool. And I'll write. I don't know if they'll ever get to a poem eventually. I just like to hear them and I like to have them. So like one of the words, for example, that I think shows up in Manifest is the word preternatural or preternatural. I was like, what does that mean? Something that science has yet to discover, but not yet, hasn't yet. So it's like, I want to take this word, I want to do something with it. I love talking to writers, but specifically poets, about the strength of language and the versatility of language. Like, as you were saying, like how to make a metaphor stronger, or how to pair like a word with like a more philosophical word to sort of change the meaning of both words, right? Like this like adjective, noun, or like adverb, verb, like those kinds of pairings. I think you can just do so much. You can change the whole meaning of a line by like swapping out like an adjective. And that's something I will always, I feel like I get so intense with things like this, and my friends are like, yeah, the words. I'm like, no, not words, okay? They mean words that mean things, okay? They mean things. And I just love it so much. And I'll just like, I'll just focus so much on like the innovation and like the uniqueness of this pairing, and it makes me love the poet like even more, like even if it comes from like, you know, people who haven't necessarily published a lot of work. Like a friend of mine, like we're like sort of experimenting with poems right now, and he's like coming up with these really cool like lines, and I'm like, I love this so much, and please continue to do this, because it's just so great. And that's what I look for poetry.
I feel like for me, the added kind of maybe complexity was that I wanted to incorporate Urdu words as well into Reza Reza, because I felt like that was a big part of Reza Reza itself. The title is an Urdu word. And so Urdu is like one of the languages that I speak at home and like with my family. And kind of just going more into depth and like researching and exploring. Like I can't even like tell you how many times I asked my mom, what does this word mean? What does this word mean? You know, how can I use that word? You know, in what context does this word function? And so I just kind of, again, like compiled a small list of a lot of these interesting, kind of beautiful, meaningful words in Urdu that kind of resonated with me. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll kind of take my time to kind of insert these into my poems and, you know, calculate, or like not calculate, but like figure out if they fit and kind of if they mean what I want them to mean, if they can communicate and convey something that extends beyond the English translation of the word. And like, I think that was a really, really nice thing, especially in terms like of me kind of expressing myself, because if I see an Urdu word on the page, I'm like, I automatically get it. I'm like, okay, that's taking it to another dimension altogether. You know, it makes me more attracted to the poem itself, because there's so many beautiful words, non-English words in non-English languages that we can't, you know, fully encapsulate or fully, you know, describe their beauty and their depth, because there's that whole translation divide, right? But I was so happy to put some Urdu in there and to kind of talk a lot about what it means to me, especially my relationship with Urdu growing up and as an adult right now. And so like, I think that maybe moving forward, I'd like to continue to expand on my Urdu vocabulary and maybe figure out more creative and innovative ways to include it in my writing without kind of compromising the meaning or kind of my intent and my ideas. So I think the language is like words, yes. I just like a lot of people, I feel like their brains work in terms of numbers and stuff. Every time I see a number, I nearly like black out. Like it's just, it's too much for me. Like I'm like, my brain doesn't work in numbers, okay? Just give me words, I will do whatever you want with them, but numbers, just no, like I can't, like that's not my thing.
The number as a word, just FIVE, 5, like that's okay, that's better.
Yeah, so I just absolutely love the whole notion of, you know, language being a whole of the writing itself, of the poem itself. It's such a beautiful kind of meaningful thing that we can't fully even put our finger on, because but just the way it carries across time and space is just, it's phenomenal. Like I think about it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't even wrap my head around this. Like it's amazing.
Speaking of language, would you like to read a poem from Reza Reza, and I could listen?
Absolutely, I would be honored to. I have like a stack of copies here that I you know, people are questioning stuff, so I'm like keeping them safe or whatever. You know, I'm just gonna hold on to them. My mom was like, you know, you should have like a bunch of copies, just, you know, so you remember your book, and so you have you know, for the future. Let's see, which one should I read? I feel like I kind of want to read Daguerreotype. Yeah, so I'm gonna go and read Daguerreotype, which is In Conversation with a Childhood Photo from 2000. Salam, little Miss Zeno, immigrant baby fist, comet character, minor history at night. I pray your bones are still almond tuft, that obtuse innocence is remembering your skin, eldest on tenterhooks, losing all to find a god in this heinous utopia, is a velvet habitus that tastes like papa's porto and sounds like mama's thumbs slicing bitter gourd. It is precious like the sight of your ascending stories of interiority. Barn red brocade, clotted cream, first snow, heavy braids, language, larceny, protecting your equation, a resurrection diet of poet's jasmine, itchy parallel yarns on the neck. Your radical final molt is shy why, adorned in apprehensions of eye. Memorize the lightning before crying. Your crucial constellations are spinning bad candy into creative economy. Nodding you to your new hands, you will bring you home, even when you're marooned on some odd earth, lost in translation, licking your liminal wounds. Thank you.
Oh, this is beautiful.
Thank you.
There's so many great words here.
I feel like it's kind of like at times like an explosion, or maybe even like an oversaturation of words just kind of in your face. And that's kind of one of the things that I didn't want to happen, but like I hope that, you know,
it's good. It's good. I like how there's still a you and a you're in all of these words. I like even the word I liked was tenterhooks, on tenterhooks. I've never heard like that. I know what it means, and I've used it before. I'm like, in a poem. I've never seen this in a poem. Maybe I need to read more poetry. But
thank you. Yeah. But yeah, like kind of going back to that whole point about like, if I see a word, I'm like, what does that mean? You know, maybe I should look it up. And kind of that's words attract me a lot. I feel like before I even start writing a poem, I have like a list of words, and I'm like, how can I use these in a poem? How can I make these into a poem or build them into a poem? And that's kind of like a core part of my writing process itself. So yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna read one poem from Manifest. It's the first poem. It's
I have my copy here.
Oh, yay.
I literally have 2 copies of this. Actually, 3.
Wow.
I have 3 of this. I was so excited. And like when I first tried to order them, I found out that they were sold out. And I was like, no, I had to wait a few months, I think maybe a little while over the summer. I was like, well, okay, now that it's available, I'm going to get like a bunch of copies so I can share this with my friends and hold on to them.
All right. So we watch the sun die. We watch the sun die together on the roof of your condo, eating apples that softened in the heat. We gorge the sin, the first and final. Our bodies are soft and naked. Everyone is naked in the streets, miles below, cries reaching in the red, mistless sky. All is illuminated in these draining sands. We cupped clarity for a moment too long, forgot our insectoid nature, whining in the ear of God. You wipe sweat from between my thighs. Time has a way of rushing intimacy, and in the same measure, makes us watch trees grow, count our half-lives, skin flushing and hard. No one dares say, I love you, or any other useless verb. Symphonies sidle between brains, the coda that burns black dust in our eyes.
That was beautiful. I think like the first set of stanzas and the last, they just struck me as so like melodious and like I feel like it's like music to my ears almost, especially, you know, we gorge the sin, the first and the final, and then symphonies sidle between brains and the coda that burns black dust in our eyes. But just I feel like it's so perfect that like the beginning and the ending is just, to me, it's like harmonious and symphonic and just beautiful. I love that combination. Just it stays in my mind a lot. Just, you know, like words that kind of slide off your tongue, and it's just the pure joy you get from that ease and that experience. That's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. It's one of those poems where I wasn't really sure what I was writing about while I was writing it, but I liked it, so I kept going.
Great. That's how it should be. Absolutely.
All right, so I want to thank you for having this conversation with me, and I'd like to thank Gap Riot and Danny and Kate for allowing us to talk to each other in this space. I love your chapbook, and I think it's beautiful, and I love what you do with language, and I want you to continue it. I want you to write more chapbooks and then a book and more things so I can follow you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Terese. Like I keep thinking that, oh my goodness, Terese is here in front of me. I'm talking to her. I've like read her work for a while, and like, wow, I can't believe this. But you know, I'm honored that I was able to be here and in this space, kind of facilitated by Danny and Kate, and to have, you know, this meaningful conversation. I feel like a sense of, you know, of closure almost, or like a sense of self-fulfillment in a way, hearing you say those things that I'd worried about for a while, and like some of my apprehensions kind of as a amateur writer, as a beginner poet, to, you know, kind of get that advice from you, given like your talent and experience. I think I'm really, really happy with kind of the wonderful conversation we were able to have, and I will keep kind of trying my best to grow and to write more and to be that poet that I want to be. And so it was a great conversation, a lovely conversation overall. I was like nervous at first. I was like, what's going to happen? What am I going to say? But like, this is great. I feel so happy right now and fulfilled.
Thank you.